Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Chris. In my past life I was a turboprop instructor for 5 years and I know and love the North York Moors area, and I'm going to take you on a typical basic fast jet training type mission. So this video will be interesting to you if that's something you want to see inside, a look behind the scenes if you like. It's also going to be interesting if you want to see what the North York Moors looks like from the air, and in Microsoft Flight Sim it is very realistic and I use a lot of extra add-ons to make it that bit more authentic, and I'll put a link in the description below for all the products that I use throughout this. And finally, if you have the RS Simulations PC-21, which is the aircraft you see sat here on the runway, then we're going to talk through lots of different things like using the avionics, using waypoints and flight plans, using ILS and autopilot. So lots of things to go on and teach in terms of using the aircraft. Mission profile for today, as you can see in this little nav map flight plan that I've produced, is a takeoff from Linton-on-Ouse, lower left. We'll go anti-clockwise around the North York Moors. We'll take in some landmarks along the way before dropping into low level at Knapton Granary, up towards Whitby, across towards south of Durham Tees. We'll do a practice diversion into Durham Tees for the ILS, and then a little bit more low level down the Helmsley Valley before passing Sutton Bank glider site into Topcliffe, and then I'm doing the Topcliffe-to-Linton transit. So this is a very busy sortie, and I'll make chapters available so you can click ahead to the bits that interest you the most. So without further ado, I'll jump in the cockpit and let's get going. So here we are in the cockpit of the PC-21. We're going to get going straight away, and I'll talk about how I've set things up in cockpit as we go. And the first event I'll be tracking outbound to my first waypoint and engaging the autopilot. Got 100% torque, 50 knots. 90 knots rotate, 10 degrees nose up, gear comes up, 120 knots, flap comes up, gears up, lights out, and the flap indicates up. For turn back parameters, if you wanted to turn back to a runway, typically we'd use 800 feet AGL and 150 knots. We'll take a left-hand turnout onto our first waypoint. The weather you see here is by SoFly Weather Preset Pro. I've taken the drizzly preset and just broken up the clouds a little bit so the sun shines through. As I depart the airfield, I'm always aware that if I had an engine failure, I want to turn back to a runway, so it looks like runway 28 at Linton would be ideal at this stage if we lost an engine. Okay, so that's through 2,400 feet. We're going to level at 3,000 feet and engage the autopilot. We'll cruise outbound at around about 300 knots. And once I've set the autopilot, I'll talk about some of the landmarks on the way out. So I'll click here, autopilot, autopilot out, and we'll also select nav, and that should take care of the rest of it. So here we are at 3,000 feet, it's turning left to intercept my outbound course, and I'm accelerating up to 300 knots. Typical checks that you perform at this stage will be your top of climb four-wheel checks, your fuel, oxy, engine, electrics and location. You'd also run through your Ferraki's checks for descent, because we're going to do low level shortly, so that's fuel, instruments, radios, altimeters, conditioning, anti-ice and safety altitude. And you'd also do your VLAS checks, your visor, lights, altimeters, radio, squawk and time of entry to low level, all on this first leg, so it gets pretty busy. But whilst we've got a little minute, in fact, let's have a look at my next event. My next event is 8.2 miles on the UFCP. Time to go till that point is 1 minute and 30. So I've got 1 minute and 30 seconds until we get to our first turn point or waypoint, which is Castle Howard. But let's have a look outside. That looks fantastic. Okay, so the first turn point isn't necessarily a turn point, it's just a point of interest. Castle Howard is actually, I think, still an avoid up to 2,000 feet, and correct me if I'm wrong, about half a mile, maybe 0.25. But you certainly wouldn't want to fly past it because they get upset with all the noise. But the way you'd normally see it, other than the fact we're steering towards it, is down on the left 1130 you can see this lake, and to the south of the lake is Castle Howard. There's usually a very long drive that comes out to the north, which was, or used to be, good for aerobatics as a line feature. But again, the noise footprint, they didn't like it so much. So let's disengage the autopilot, give us our stick back, and we will descend on down. After this fly past of this point of interest, we'll go on to Knapton Granary and the low-level entry point. But this one building is actually part of a freeware add-on that I'm using. Again, link in the description below. And it looks pretty cool. Nice. Okay, full power, torque's coming up, temperature's coming up, autopilot. Now, with altitude and nav. The next point of interest will be Malton Magnet. Students used to love flying over the top of this, or to the side of this for aerobatics, because it's close enough to Linton that you can recover easily, and it's such a big feature that you can't really miss it when you're up there at 6,000 or 7,000 feet. So let's have a look outside for this one. There's a really obvious feature you can see. I think Malton is the northern part. There's a river that bisects the two. It's a bit of a butterfly feature. And you can also see there's a road going around the northern edge, so a really obvious feature to pick up. If I was going south over the Wolds, I would use this junction here to head off down in that direction, and I'll probably do that in a separate video. Okay, next event is low-level entry. We are 3.4 miles away. That'll take us 30 seconds, so I'll disengage the autopilot. I will say that I've done all the checks, and what I'm going to do is come off my route, because what you don't want to do is descend on top of, on top of anything that might be flying beneath you. So what I'm doing is a clearing turn, standard practice for low-level sorties, or if you had a 90-degree turn into your low-level entry point, then that would also suffice. There's nice power lines coming down the north of our track and tracking alongside, and Knapton Granary unfortunately isn't properly modelled, but this is Knapton Granary here. I'm a little fast. The technique usually is to be on speed, on track, wing level from your low-level entry point, but we're there or thereabouts. Okay, we're flying at 300 knots. My first feature, in fact my next turn point, is 7.3 miles away. My track is 085, and that's important to remember because what this autopilot will do as part of, I think it's Microsoft's coding, it will assume that I want to do a rate 1 turn onto my next outbound track, which is obviously not what I want to do at low level. So 085 is what we want. The Wolds to the south, you can see this ridge line. This was really useful to teach contouring. So if you're flying at low level, you need to be able to move with the hills. So we'd point towards them and teach that in order to contour, you need to pull up the nose early, apply power so you don't slow down too much, look over the top of the hill, and then lower the nose to achieve your 250 feet MSD or slightly greater as you get over the top of the hill. So that is basic contouring. We'd also teach contouring and turning. So 6-degree bank was the norm. We can go up to 90, but we don't usually teach that for students. In order to lower the nose, whilst keeping the angle of bank the same, is just ease off the back pressure. You see the nose comes down. Very simple intro to contouring. And you can see my course bar is now snapped to a northerly heading, but I'm going to come right onto 085. I should be still roughly on track to my first turn point. And this one is Staxton Wold radar head, which is a really nice feature back in the day. And I think it's also part of the freeware add-on that I'm using. Big old golf ball just to left 11 o'clock. Here we go. Very cool. So around this corner, we'll try and feed in between Staxton Wold, these two little villages here. And then our next track is, by the looks of it, 310. So I'm noting 310. I'm also noting I'm slightly right of track because of course deviation bars to the left. And looking ahead, another thing to teach is to look out for these power lines. So actually there's a row of power lines, and we don't want to infringe our 250 feet MSD. So I'll ease up over the top of that. And also as a large feature that I'd look at the map is this water feature here, and we don't tend to fly over them because birds like water and aeroplanes don't like birds, so we tend not to fly over the top. So looks like 310, 320, that works out. We'll keep on track here until we get to our next fix, which is going to be the corner of a forest on the North York Moors. From here we'll then do a little bit of free nav through the valleys, and I'll show you RAF Valley before heading up towards Whitby and then westbound. So really important if you are doing a route like this is to do map study to see what things will look like. So from the top, a really obvious corner of a wood Doesn't stand out so well as you're flying past it, but that is the corner of the wood I'm after. Look right, left. Scarborough's off in that direction, and Whitby will be to the right 1 o'clock. Okay, so heading about 352. Off to the left is Fylingdales. I think that's an avoid out to 5 miles radius and 10,000 feet, I think. In essence, don't go close to it. These are always quite nice because you can get below the level of the hillside and actually do some proper valley flying. It's gone a bit dark. As soon as the sun goes away, you lose a bit of contrast and it gets a little harder to miss the trees because they all blend into one. So from here, we're kind of 355. This could be a good target run. And we're going up towards a caravan site. And it's really easy because the avionics we have here, I mean, it tells me time to go is 37 seconds, next waypoint is 3 miles away, and it's already tripped across to the next turn, so I know 340 is my next heading. So really simple to find your way around. So here, what I'll do is I'll climb up and show you Fylingdales in the background. And this is part of, I think, the Orbex scenery. You see it in the background. Down we go. There's my turn point. Really nice, obvious feature. And good to see that the sun's back out. Okay, we are tracking 327. We have 13 miles to go, and a little bit more on this information here. So we've got 2 minutes 25 to my next turn point. The estimated timer en route for my low level portion is just over 10 minutes, so it's really useful to have that all up. Our next turn point is a quarry, and as part of one of the add-ons I've got, it actually puts in some really nice cranes, and rather illegally I'm just going to fly in between them all and over the top of the quarry, but look at those, they look really cool. It's really key when you're flying is to divert most of your attention to the right 2 o'clock to the left 10 o'clock. And there's Whitby off to the right 2 o'clock. And we're heading this direction. So it's really important to keep that scan going, otherwise you will bump into things. And there are a few masts and towers around that are about the same altitude as you are, or height above the ground. Okay, we're 9.4 miles to the next turn point. This valley is a little bit ambiguous as it's not as steep-sided and there's lots of towns and forests and things cluttering the way, so we'll try our best. All I'm doing is scanning between what I think is the valley and my course bar to make sure I'm tracking roughly in the right direction. And if you're practicing low level in this aircraft, the nice thing is you can slow it down to 240 knots, which flies you at 4 miles a minute, or you can fly at 300 knots, which is 5 miles a minute. So you can choose how fast you want to fly. The maximum speed of this aircraft is 370 knots, so as long as you don't exceed that, you're good to go. So one of the towers I talked about is just here. Sticks out pretty well, but you could easily bump into it or get very close to it. I think that's really neat. Okay, so the next thing we're going to come across is Roseberry Topping. And that, I believe, is a lava plug, a volcanic feature. And it's also good for the hikers, and it also gives you a spot between, well, if you go north of Roseberry Topping too far, then you hit Durham Tees airspace. But I love how the sun goes through the clouds and just highlights the hillsides a little bit. In fact, let's have a look from the outside whilst we're here. We've got 9 miles. Yeah, we're good. How cool does that look? Okay, where are we now? 7 miles. It's been a while since we've done any ops checks, so remember every 10 minutes, every couple of legs, we should really check the fuel, oxy, engine electrics, and location. The fuel is good, and I'm breathing fine. And location-wise, Durham Tees is going to be our nearest. And when we get close enough, my VOR indicator, the green one lower right, is actually going to turn pink. And the green needle is going to point towards Durham Tees, which is really useful. Especially when I try and position myself front. Microsoft, don't you do it. Always seems to stutter just there. Interesting. Now it's getting dark again. So like I was saying, Teeside Valley, we're going to fly an ILS, self-position for ILS, with a little bit of emergency. Maybe we'll throw in some considerations for bird strike, and then we'll do a low approach and then come back into low level and finish off with a tour of Topcliffe, Sutton Bank, and then back to Linton for a couple of circuits. Okay, 3.4 miles left to go. About 296 is the heading, so I'm going to hold this, and just as I've done that, the course bar is snapped onto the next heading. And it also gives you the range to your next waypoint, which is over that way somewhere, which is a shame, but I can see in the 12 o'clock my next turn point. So here we go, this mound in the 12 o'clock, Roseberry Topping. I always thought it was Rosemary Topping, but apparently it's Roseberry. And it even got a little bit of a rainbow going on. How nice is that? There we go. So say for instance we hit a bird at this stage, what I do is leave the throttle where it is, roll the wings level, climb away from the ground, think about whether I need to eject from the aircraft, but the engine looks like it's operating normally, but also think about where my nearest is, which is off to the right 1 o'clock-ish for Durham Tees. So I tune them into radio or talk on guard and say, hey, this is us, we'd like to enter the airspace between 2,000 and 3,000 feet for self-position to ILS with a bird strike. So what I'm now going to do is head kind of north-northwest over Teeside and position myself for the ILS. So a couple of things we need to set up whilst we do that. But as I think it's not the engine that's a problem, so I'm going to pull the power and start slowing down, ready to configure. A couple of other things we need to do is we can then set our nav source to VOR1, which is ILS, it's pink. On the ground I already set it to 230, so it's got the inbound course. Now I'm not following the ILS perfectly, that looks about right. I'm backing up my visual approach. But I'll also show you a little bit about using the glide path information and using autopilot for the approach. So here we go. I'm going to descend down to 1,900 feet. I'll probably go down to 1,500 feet before I intercept the localizer. I can see the glide path on the EADI, which is above us, and the localizer off to the right-hand side, which matches the pink needle here. Yeah, let's go down to 1,500 feet. That'll work. You'll see the pink needle, the small pink needle, is pointing towards Durham Tees as opposed to the course bar, which is set for the inbound track. And when the two align, I should be on the localizer, he says. What I'm aiming to do is slow the aircraft down to 160 knots, ready to configure, and I'll do a takeoff approach, i.e. one stage of flaps and 120 knot approach speed. And I'll talk about why in just a second. Cool, so below 200 knots, that's good. We're below the glide path, intercepting, but look at the scenery around here. Teeside is very, very well produced. Okay, 6 miles to Durham Tees. I can see it just out to the left 11 there. Now, I call it Durham Tees. I think it's Teeside International now. Come on. Don't make me rush. Cool, here comes the the localizer. Put the gear down. Now, I wouldn't ordinarily use flap because this aircraft can land so slow that it doesn't need a long runway. And with a bird strike to the wing, you probably wouldn't want to move any flaps if you can help it. But we're going to go flaps to takeoff, 120 knots for the descent. We're slightly high on the glide path, but I'll talk about that in a second. 3 greens, flaps to takeoff, and looking at the glide path. Once you're on the glide path, of course, with the pink horizontal line in the middle, you can set the flight path marker on 2.5 or 3 degrees, whatever the glide slope is for the ILS, and it should roughly track on its way down. The other thing you can do is click approach and autopilot. As long as you're reasonably well established, it will take over and keep you on it. Now sometimes it doesn't quite match what you think it should be, so I'm not going to take it any further. Let's fly this one manually. But that's an option as well. And the other thing you'll notice is you've got no ILS information in the head-up display. So if you want that, you can go to Instructor page, HUD F18 to PC-21, and now you can see we have the horizontal and vertical line, which gives you your positioning versus the localizer and the glide path. It is pretty cluttered and not ideal, but if you wanted it, it's there. I will disable it and go back to F18. Okay, let's have a look from the outside whilst we're here. That looks glorious. Okay, so from here, we're going to do a low approach and depart VFR. We'll say the clearance is not above 3,000 feet. Depart south of the field, call leaving the zone. So that's our clearance to depart. We're in a good place for this approach. We're just going to go around. We'll wait until we're just over the threshold and then we'll execute. Now the scenery here is also freeware. Again, link in the description below. Teeside International. And it looks pretty darn good, especially for freeware, so I recommend downloading that. Okay, 10 degrees, nose up, gear up, flap up. Awesome. They used to have Cobham here. The two blue jets you see there are electronic attack type practice aircraft, and they'll fly against Typhoons and F-35s and pretend to be the bad guys, which is pretty neat. Okay, whilst I've distracted myself, gear up, flap up. We were above 1,000 feet. We'll turn outbound now from route study about, let's see, 110, maybe 100 will work for the heading. And as a technique, I'll fly out at 250 knots, because that way it slows the aircraft down a little bit and I'll get myself ahead of it in terms of planning. I'm also keeping an eye on where Durham Tees Valley is. There I go again, Durham Tees Valley. I think it's Teeside International. So if I need to turn back to it, it's pretty easy to get to. Okay, so flying the aircraft first. The information lower right will give me my range. When I'm about 5 or 6 miles on that range, I'm clear of the zone. But what I can do with my primary navigation is set it back to MC, and that'll show me the way to get to the Helmsley Valley, which is coming up next. Look at that. Very cool. So what is next? Helmsley Valley. Ah yes, checks. So at this stage you need to do your Farrakis checks to go into descent. You need to do your FOWL checks to do an ops check. And you really need to do your VLAS checks to go back into low level. All of that I should have done before I went into Durham Tees, to be honest, but you get the idea. So I think the town that we're coming up on is Stokesley. Fly a little bit more accurately. And of course it's auto-sequenced to my next waypoint, which is kind of the south end of the Helmsley Valley. But we can use that by heading east until the blue line or the course deviation index centralizes, and then we know we're pretty much on the right track. The Helmsley Valley is down to right here, and we can cut the corner if we like. In fact, let's do that a little bit. And because I'm ahead of the aircraft, I can speed up to 300 knots. Roseberry Topping, where we flew past, is, I think, is it there? Or it could be there. I think it might be that one. So here we go. There are a couple of ways to get into the Helmsley Valley. The traditional way is this V shape, which is more obvious if you're coming from the left-hand side, from the east. Is that right? East-west? Yeah, got it right. But from here you can see a road entering the valley, and that's where we're going. Let's put our engine page back on. Engine's working. Fuel, we've got plenty. So now I'm going to show you the Helmsley Valley and the Bilsdale Mast, which you can almost see now coming up on the west side of it. I think that's another Orbex feature. I think about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, they had a fire and it wiped out the TV for the locals, which is always pretty bad. Can't get rid of the TV. Alright, so here we are in another valley. Ordinarily, valleys for military aircraft have flow arrows, which dictates which direction you head down them, so that when you fly down it in a high-performance aircraft, you don't meet nose-to-nose with somebody else. Now, this valley doesn't, but traditionally, we'd always go north to south. And I have come across a few helicopters going northbound, and luckily I was at 250 feet, and they were about 400, maybe 500, and I saw them with enough time. My next turn point is going to be in 7.5 miles, and that is in 1 minute and 20 seconds. There's the mast. On the opposite side of this ridgeline is Topcliffe, but we're going to hang around. I'll show you the tight valley at the bottom of the Helmsley Valley, the twists and turns, and then we'll go past Sutton Bank and into Topcliffe. I'm just astounded at how accurate this sim is. I mean, there's a few more trees than you'd expect, I guess, but the features, as I point out on the way into Topcliffe, are just spot on. It's fantastic. Beautiful. Now it's really easy not to get lost, if that makes sense, because at the south end of the valley you're presented with a wall like this. You don't want to go right because that'll take you to Sutton Bank, and generally you don't want to fly through their airspace. So we'll go left and we'll go down to the village of Helmsley. Just so very nice. There's also an abbey here, and I'm not going to even pretend to know how to pronounce it. But I don't think it's modelled. It'd be nice to see that one added. So this traditionally is flown at 240 knots. At 300 knots you definitely need to use 90 degrees bank. But you can just about make it all the way down. But you've got to take the racing line. Now here's another good top tip, or thing to be aware of, is when you're going into sun, hills kind of hide themselves in front of each other, so it's really hard when the hill is silhouetted to see any rising ground before it. So that is a hazard. This is also a good test if you're staying at 250 feet, because if you go any higher you're above the valley, which is boring. Oh, this airplane is so much fun to fly, even in a sim. Alright, that is about it. We are now at the southeast corner of Helmsley Valley. This is where the manor house would be, or at least the grounds of it, and that's Helmsley Village. And we will swing a right onto a westerly heading and go and find Sutton Bank. Now Sutton Bank is a really good glider site, and especially given that Microsoft Flight Sim has just implemented gliders properly, I think my next port of call will be to try it out at Sutton Bank, because the positioning, as you'll see in a minute, is excellent if you're a glider pilot. And the other thing I'll mention is that you wouldn't fly through it. I've already mentioned it once. You wouldn't fly through Sutton Bank like this, although I know a few students that have, but they tend to get upset when you do it. A good feature at this point is, I think it's the Harden Hills? I think it's Harden Hills, just here, and the Wold's further south, and we're just skimming the south edge of the North York Moors still. And the sun is coming out. Let's have a look from outside. I guess the main feature of Sutton Bank glider site is the white horse, which is a little bit overgrown. Apparently it's in a little bit of disrepair in real life, but here you can see the white horse and Sutton Bank glider site. And as you can see on this ridge line here, it's just perfect if you want to do any gliding. For the general aviation enthusiast, there is another little airfield. Here it is. Just see it poking out of that field there. That is Bagby, I believe. What we're going to do is intercept what would be the Linton to Topcliffe transit, and I think it's at 1400 feet. Our steering has snapped over to where Topcliffe is, so Topcliffe is 4.2 miles away, but we'll come up to Thirsk, this town. The A1 I think passes up to the east of it, and we'll hang around and then come back into Topcliffe, which is in this area. In fact, I think that might be it. Also in this area is RAF Leeming, if you're interested in flying the Hawks. I mean, look at it, this looks fantastic. What I could do at this stage is go to, I don't know, VOR2, set my course to 200-ish, and that gives me a reference for the runway, which is just here. Keeping Thirsk on the left side, calling initial, Topcliffe Tower. And I'm not going to do a circuit here because it'll take too long, and we're doing circuits at Linton. What we'll do is a cheeky little loop over the runway. More cranes. Very cool. I think the Yorkshire Air Ambulance still is based here. And this is all default, nothing added to this, so it's a pretty basic Topcliffe. But here we go for the loop. If you're interested in knowing how to fly some aerobatics in this aircraft, check out my other video, which I'll link in the usual places. Over the top, 2,800 feet. Line is good. And there we go, that'll do. That will do for a loop. So as if we've just done a go around or a touch and go, what I'll do is I'll make sure gear and flap is up. Yes, we'll take a left-hand turn towards this industrial estate. We'll keep to 1,000 feet as we do that. Gets really busy. 250 knots, just to slow things down a little bit. And we'll also be talking to Linton, or we would be because Linton's shut now, but we talk to Linton Tower and say we're on the Topcliffe-Linton transit. Here's the industrial estate, and we'll also go on and find the railway line that goes north to south. All default scenery. Awesome. Here's where I get a bit twitchy. So I'm trying to find the train line. It doesn't stand out brilliantly. I'm also trying to fly at 1,000 feet, which I'm getting a bit wrong. But the power lines cross it, and I think this is the train line. So train lines are usually straight. They have trees along the edges, and that helps them stand out. So that is my train line. Let's go back up to 300 knots now that I'm sure of where I am. And my next event is to move to the left, because at the moment, in fact, let's put my steering back onto MC. We're steering to Linton, which is 5.3 miles away. So at 4 miles, or 4.5, I need to head on towards Wold, which is over this direction, so that I can move back in for initial. What you should be looking for is a disused airfield, which is here, stands out brilliantly. That's my disused airfield. That should be about 4 miles, and now I'll take a left turn towards Wold. It's amazing how much detail is in this sim. And from here, I'm going to struggle to find Topcliffe, unless it's in the sunshine somewhere. No, not Topcliffe, Linton. But we'll go back in and do a couple of visual circuits. Here's Wold. That's pointing me back to Linton. What I'll do initially is face up onto heading. Oh, look at that. There is the runway. And that's why it's useful to run visual features and follow it by the numbers. Okay, so calling initial, which should be 3 miles. I think it was anyway. About half a mile displaced to the dead side. I'm doing a right-hand pattern, so that's how we're doing that. We'll request a low brake, which will be about 200 AGL, visually judged. And we'll do a couple of patterns. Looks excellent. Okay, 300 knots. Dead side, reciprocal will be 0.3 for reference. Runway's clear. Downwind is clear. Roll, pull, idle, air brake. About 500 feet MSL downwind. 030. 180 knots. Air brake comes in. Gear, flap to take off. Looking for 120 knots for the final turn. Hopefully I'm not too wide. We've got 3 greens, we've got flaps to take off. 45 degrees, we'll power up, we'll go flaps down, but we're going to stay level initially around this final portion. I think about 650 feet, but we'll stick with it. I haven't got my QFE set. And then halfway around, or 2/3 of the way around, we'll reduce the power, intercept the final turn, confirm I've definitely got my flaps down. And that actually wasn't half bad, I'll accept that. Turn is pretty much made. I'll power off to slow down to threshold speed. Stall speed configured I think is about 82 knots. You going to get the numbers? Oh, a little bit long, but not too bad. Okay, lower the nose, power comes on, stay straight with the rudders. 90 knots, rotate, 10 degrees nose up. Engine's good, gear comes up. Gear is up, lights out, 120 knots-ish, flap comes up all the way. At about 400 feet, I'll clear downwind. I'll pull the power. Gear and flap are now up. 500 feet. I'll do a, what should we go for, 45 degree bank? Let's try that. I don't want to go much above 160 because that's the speed you want to start your configuration at. Now probably a little bit wide. Have a look. Not entirely accurate, it's hard to see the altitude, but I'm a little bit low. Spacing looks okay. I'm going to try and keep the runway inside this little roundel here. That should be a decent downwind spacing. Okay, power comes back. Downwind headings good 030. Gear, flap to take off. I could also do flap all the way down if I want to. It's all a technique. Looking for 120 knots for the final turn. Just leaving the power set. That's 123, 121. Got 45 degrees from the threshold. About 10 degrees nose down and about 45 degrees bank. Looking for about 750, 700 feet halfway around. Looking at the pappies as well, looking at the runway lineup. Keeping the 120 knots. Glide path, aim point, airspeed type deal. That's my cross check. Want to see a red on the pappies? There's a red. 3 reds. Put the flight path marker on the threshold. Pull the power. Trim, trim, trim. Look to the end of the runway. Pull the power to idle. Flare. And that concludes this sortie. So if you're still watching, thank you so much for still being here. Please consider liking and subscribing. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments below. But until the next time, take care.